Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, just pop along to Patreon, patreon.com/The History Network. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 31, Episode 5, War in the Philippines. This episode was written by Mike Harran. At the end of the 19th century, tensions had been high between the United States and Spain, the point of friction being Spanish colonial rule, specifically in Cuba. When the USS Maine mysteriously exploded in Havana harbour, it pushed the American President McKinley into war with Spain. Ostensibly, the war was to support rebels fighting Spanish colonialism. As the Americans blockaded Cuba in the Pacific, the US Asiatic Fleet attacked the Spanish Navy stationed in the Philippines. At the Battle of Manila Bay, the Spanish fleet proved vastly inferior to the US Navy. The victory by Commodore George Dewey essentially liberated the Philippines from the Spanish. But while the anti-Spanish rebel leader Aguinaldo had returned to his native Philippines to fight with the Americans, the United States was not inclined to support any declaration of Philippine independence. Emilio Aguinaldo, on his return to the Philippines, set about working towards the country's independence, drafting a new constitution, placing himself at the head of a revolutionary government and raising a small army. With his American allies, Aguinaldo laid siege to the Spanish forces holding out in Manila. The Spanish commander knew there was no hope of relief. At the same time, he refused to capitulate to what he perceived to be the Filipino rebels. The compromise was a mock battle that was agreed between the Spanish and the Americans to satisfy Spanish honour and allow them to surrender to the Americans. In doing so, Philippine sovereignty passed to the Americans, which would be confirmed in the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1898. Aguinaldo and his revolutionaries felt betrayed by their American allies. As power passed to the Americans, random acts of violence against what some Filipinos saw as another occupying force blossomed into a full-scale resistance movement, with Emilio Aguinaldo central to the movement. Aguinaldo's forces, armed with captured Spanish weapons, were no match for the professional and well-equipped US Army. After a string of victories for the Americans, the Filipino forces all but ceased to exist as a field army, and the fighting deteriorated into guerrilla warfare, with Aguinaldo's men using hit-and-run tactics. To combat the threat of the insurrectos, a term the Americans coined to refer to the local rebel fighters in both Cuba and the Philippines, the US Army was forced to send out small patrols to scour the countryside looking for the rebel bases. For days, American infantry might trek along thick bamboo-ridden jungle trails or mountain gorges before encountering any insurrectos. Such clashes would be brief, with the rebels letting loose a few rounds before disappearing into the countryside and blending invisibly back into the local villages. Operating in the La Union province, some 270 miles northwest of Manila, Lieutenant Johnston discovered the insurrectos operated a discreet second government, running parallel with the American-backed administration. Johnston noted how local officials, the police, mayor and village chiefs, were all often complicit in actively working with the officials. The lieutenant's breakthrough had come when Crispulo Patajo had been arrested as a suspected outlaw and turned over to the Americans. In the coming weeks, Patajo worked with Johnston to identify guerrillas, their camps and supply depots. Crucially, it was the intelligence Johnston gathered from Patajo that revealed the connection between rebel bands and the towns that supplied and sheltered them. U.S. Army Major Bateman gave Patajo a command of his own unit of 400 to 500 volunteers who acted as a counter-insurgency vigilante force. The unit patrolled with the Americans and proved very successful, targeting insurrectos, specifically local Filipino officials working for Aguinaldo. Bateman's operations with Patajo proved a big success as local officials who supported Aguinaldo were routed out and key rebel leaders arrested and ammunition caches captured. These operations culminated in a daring raid on the headquarters of Aguinaldo in the mountains north of Luzon, with Filipinos loyal to the Americans acting as insurrectos who were bringing captured Americans to Aguinaldo. The trap was set. After a short scuffle where Aguinaldo was wrestled to the floor, the rebels surrendered. Though the capture of Aguinaldo made good newspaper headlines, it failed to quell the violence directed at the American administration in the Philippines. More importantly, at home in the US, public support for the war, never high to start with, was waning even further. A quick resolution was needed. Abner Chaffee took over military command of the US forces from Arthur MacArthur. He identified 3 trouble spots: southwestern Luzon, Samar, and Cebu. Chaffee believed that for too long American soldiers had been performing civil service tasks. It was now time they performed their military function. For the first time in decades, the small port of Balangiga on the southwestern coast of Samar was troubled by pirates. The inhabitants of Balangiga requested American military support, and a US Army detachment was duly sent. While the American troops were breakfasting on the morning of the 28th of September 1901, the local Filipino police chief opened fire on the unsuspecting troops. This was the signal for others to join in. 59 US soldiers would be killed and 23 wounded. The attack caused an outcry in the USA. The massacre was equated with Custer's last stand. Irrespective that this attack might not be directly motivated for political ends, but rather in anger of American occupation and grievances to locals of their treatment, Chaffee was swift to conduct operations in the area. Infantry reinforcements were dispatched, which included a Gatling gun, supported by a cannon-armed river gunboat. They were under orders to quell any rebel activity. General Jacob Smith, commanding troops in the area, issued the following instructions. I want no prisoners. I wish you to kill and burn. The more you kill and burn, the better you will please me. I want all persons killed who are capable of bearing arms in actual hostilities against the United States. During the American Civil War, General Order 100 had been issued during Sherman's march to the sea as he campaigned through Georgia. This order stated that those carrying out military acts out of uniform were subject to arrest without a warrant and a court-martial. This order was now deemed to be also applicable in Samar. Over the next year, the US Army practiced a scorched earth policy on Samar. They trudged through dangerous jungles, burning towns, taking food, and either killing the people or taking them to coastal villages for internment. General Smith enacted a policy where it was no longer possible to avoid suspicion by appearing to be neutral or by providing worthless information. In order to avoid suspicion, Filipinos were expected to perform such acts as leading an American patrol to guerrilla camps, denouncing local officials working for the guerrillas, and providing tangible intelligence that would aid the Americans. Thousands of Filipinos, mostly non-combatants, were killed during the Samar campaign. It became the most gruesome campaign of the entire Philippine-American War. These operations on Samar flew in the face of the claim by the Federal Party and the Filipino Commission headed by the future President Taft that the insurgents were on their last legs. When questioned whether the reprisal raids were legal, Chaffee, who had participated in the raising of the Shenandoah Valley, during the US Civil War in 1864, answered, "If it was okay to commit atrocities against Americans in time of war, it is also okay to do so to Filipinos." When news of the slash-and-burn tactics overseen by General Smith on Samar became known in the USA, they caused outrage, and Smith himself faced a court-martial. In the subsequent trial, the following conversation was reported to have taken place between Smith and his subordinate, Major Waller. In response to Smith's kill and burn edict mentioned earlier, Waller asked, "I would like to know the limit of age to respect, sir." 10 years, Smith said. "Persons of 10 years and older are those designated as being capable of bearing arms?" replied Waller. "Yes," said Smith, confirming his instructions. Smith would eventually be found guilty of conduct to the prejudice of good order and military discipline, and forced to retire from the army. General James Franklin Bell took a similar attitude to General Smith when it came to dealing with the insurrectos. Assuming command of Batangas in Luzon, Bell viewed his job as making the Filipino population want to make peace, and to want to make it badly. In order to protect those who wanted peace, he set up protected zones, ordering those who wanted to be safe to move into these camps within 20 days. All territory outside these zones was considered to be enemy territory. Bell theorized that as the guerrillas wore no uniforms, they were not entitled to be treated as prisoners of war, but as saboteurs. As Bell's provost marshals dismantled infrastructure within the concentrated zones, infantry patrols crisscrossed the open fields, rooting out Filipinos outside the safe zones, who were now deemed to be guerrillas. On one night, 1,800 troops established a cordon stretching 10 miles from the outskirts of Batangas. The next morning, Bell's troops began slowly moving across the area, killing animals, destroying crops, and any structures they encountered. This destruction wrought 500 tons of rice burned, 200 water buffalo killed, 800 cattle, and 680 horses killed, thousands of pigs, chickens, and goats killed, with more than 600 houses destroyed. Such actions drew condemnation from the American public, who described Bell as another General Weyler, a Cuban-based Spanish general who prior to hostilities had earned the name Butcher Weyler due to the concentration camps in Cuba leading up to the Spanish-American War. In the jungles, Miguel Malvar, who had replaced Emilio Aguinaldo as head of the insurrectos, was now down to just 2,500 armed fighters. Demoralized, some units killed their officers and disbanded, the fighters returning quietly to civil life. On April 6, 1902, Malvar himself surrendered to the Americans. The well-publicized atrocities committed on the Philippines had tarnished the reputation of the US Army. The nature of the fighting can be seen in the reported guerrilla casualty figures. Usually in armed conflict, the wounded outnumber the dead. The inverse is true in the Philippines, where over 14,000 rebels were reported to have been killed and just over 3,000 wounded. The outraged American public demanded an inquiry. Following President McKinley's assassination, the incoming President Roosevelt continued the Philippines inquiry, admitting that there were irregularities, but did not push the issue. By contrast, the war in Cuba lasted only a few months, but engaged a greater amount of attention than the one in the Philippines. The charge of Roosevelt's Rough Riders, described in endearing tones as that splendid little war, so different the theme to that pervading the Philippines, and as such it conveniently eclipsed the US involvement in the Philippines, and the war is now largely overlooked and forgotten in the USA. Thanks, Mike, for writing that script for us. If you'd like to write a script for us, drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org. with your ideas for that, and we'll take a look. Thanks once again to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Mike Haran, read by Nick Barker.